Hi everyone. My name is Janie, and I will be doing culture appropriation in comics for LIS 518. So, culture appropriation involves a dominant group that exploits the culture of less privileged groups with little to no understanding of the later's history, traditions, and experiences. Scabati states that culture appropriation is the taking of intellectual property, traditional knowledge, cultural expressions, or artifacts without permission. An important question is not whether culture appropriation exists, but whether it is harmful to the people that are exploited by this phenomenon. The philosopher Young states that he is deeply, not philosopher, author Young states that he is deeply skeptical about the claim that artists will do much harm to the cultures from which they borrow. This trivial attitude towards culture appropriation runs rampant in Western culture, who ironically are the main perpetrators of this tendency, especially in art and artistic expression, in which culture appropriation results in misuse, misrepresentation, and theft of art form and heritage in manners that can easily be interpreted as insulting by the cultures from which art forms are stolen. Simply put, what Matthews calls outsiders, or people of culture that are different from those being appropriated, are more likely to get it wrong. Furthermore, culture appropriation in art often happens to people that have been historically dominated and socially marginalized, and there's a more justified sensitivity among the people who can perceive that their culture is being stolen by the very people who have marginalized them. So here are two examples the of mainstream society that I want to show you before I get into the comics. The woman on the left is just a model wearing a headdress, and the panel on the right is a picture of Katy Perry, who was wearing a geisha outfit at a concert. And a personal example of mine is the high school I went to, Cuga Secondary School, and their slogan "Home of the Warriors." In 2004, when I was in grade 10, the student First Nation student body issued a complaint to the principal because the football team had like this native war chant that they would do before they played a game, and it was considered offensive to the native students. But the principal objected and said it wasn't a big deal and that we had to get 50% of the student body vote in order to change the name of the school, which was extremely difficult and it never happened. Cohen talks about, or sorry, now we're moving into Asian culture appropriation, or appropriation of Asian culture in Western comics. So Cohen talks about Asian culture and comics and asserts that martial arts have not been accurately represented in comics or film for that matter. This inaccurate representation speaks to the point I made a few slides back. Not only is Western popular culture stealing cultural icons from Asian people, but they are presenting them to the public in a way that doesn't get it right. Characters in comics that have appropriated Asian culture typically embody a component of mysticism. Son calls this type of culture appropriation magical Asians, one of the most common and painful persistent portrayals of Asians in comics. She says Marvel has an Asian problem, and as an Asian woman, she finds it profoundly uncomfortable. Her term, magical Asians, is based off the concept of Orientalism. Orientalism is a concept that was first introduced by Edward Said in his book Orientalism. He talks about how cultural representations, which are the basis of Orientalism, are based on the Western's patronizing representations of the East, which include Asia, North Africa, and the Middle East. It is this concept of Orientalism that is portrayed in comics in such a way that, according to San, is the exotifying of Eastern and Middle Eastern culture. Westerns have viewed the Eastern world as a fantasy of strange religion, bright colors, barbaric practices, incomprehensible languages, mysticism, magic, ninjas, and kung fu. And this inaccurate and imaginary Asian world stuck around in modern culture and continues to have a deep resonance in comics both in storyline and illustration. As a result, clothing worn by characters appropriating Asian culture implies that Southeast Asian dress is exotic and always similar. The dress of such a character is a stereotype that merges Asian dress into a limited variation of costumes that, from a Western perspective, represents Asian culture. But in reality, clothing in China is different from clothing in Japan, Thailand, Vietnam, etc. Mortal Kombat was originally a video game franchise that started in 1992 and grew in immense popularity. It got its own cartoon show and a comic book series that continues to this day. Mortal Kombat, in my view, is one of the strongest examples of San's term of magical Asian, in that the creators have appropriated different Asian cultures that adhere to Said's or adhere to the concept of Orientalism. It is based on a fictional universe where legendary warriors know martial arts with supernatural powers. There are secret ninja clans, a strong element of mysticism. There are elder gods and monks who worship in secret and arts to strange and powerful kung fu techniques, and for its violence and barbaric death scenes in which characters use their martial arts to kill other characters. So I think this comic is popular because it is, as what San says, that this type of culture appropriation is based on the Western's pop culture default position on Asians, which is Orientalism. In the image on the left, Raiden is seen wearing the traditional Nunla hat. Nunla is the Vietnamese word for that hat that he's wearing. And the woman on the right, she's wearing a similar hat, a similar style. And both characters are white and in the Mortal Kombat universe. This hat was traditionally used to work outside and worn for traveling to protect from the elements, and it's been around for 3,000 years. But the website TV Trope makes a good point that in art and entertainment, this hat is always associated with Asian culture, no matter what the circumstances. You can take a white character, which is exactly what the creators of Mortal Kombat are doing with these two characters, put these hats on their head, and they're automatically regarded as Asian. The hat is the most recognized symbol of Asian culture, specifically Chinese culture. And TV Trope says that if someone wears this hat, they almost always begin to imitate a Chinese voice. So regardless of whether or not it makes sense for the character to be wearing such a hat, and with this case, it really doesn't make sense for this supposedly god of thunder to be wearing this hat, or this woman who is supposed to be living in the netherworld. It doesn't really make sense for them to be wearing these hats. I mean, it doesn't really serve a practical use. It's just more of a aesthetic option to like a culture appropriation aesthetic option that basically just kind of solidifies that they are apparently appropriating Chinese culture. Um, and also, if you notice, the characters are wearing kind of a similar style of clothing, almost like a monk robe. But again, I mentioned before that a Western perspective, pop culture, they always tend to merge the different cultures together so that in a stereotype that all Asian culture is the same. So we don't actually know what style this is being derived from. It's just kind of reinforcing the idea that all Asian culture is the same. That they wear these hats and they wear these robes, and they go around fighting. And they go around using their kung fu to fight crime. Also, you'll note that the female character is showing a little bit more cleavage than is necessary, and I'll talk about that more in detail in a later slide. There has been controversy in the comic world regarding Iron Fist, and that the character being Caucasian, despite clearly appropriating East Asian culture and embodying Western stereotypes. Iron Fist is being highly criticized right now. It's happening in the media. It's on Google. It's on Facebook because they're coming out with I believe, an HBO TV series, Iron Fist. So I've seen the trailers for it, but it's getting a lot of criticism for appropriating Asian culture. So Iron Fist uses Kung Fu to defeat his enemies while channeling the power of a dragon through its chi. One would think that it would be natural to portray a character who exhibits these characteristics as Asian, but Iron Fist is a blue-eyed, blonde-haired male who happens to also be a billionaire. So in an interview with the creator of Iron Fist, Roy Thomas, and someone asked him about culture appropriation, he had this to say. Yeah, someone made me vaguely aware of that. I try not to think about it too much. I have so little patience for some of the feelings that some people have. I mean, I understand where it's coming from, culture appropriation. My God, it's just an adventure story. Don't these people have something better to do than to worry about the fact that Iron Fist isn't Oriental or whatever the word? I know Oriental isn't the right word now either. So, Thomas is 76 years old. He seems very unapologetic and even defiant when discussing the argument that his character is appropriating East Asian culture. He is quoted in an interview conducted by Anji Han, expressing himself with an attitude that is unfortunately persuasive among those who share his sentiment. Thomas seems to be stuck in a time when Iron Fist was created. Han suggests that just because the idea of Iron Fist was accepted in the 1970s, it's no reason to drag Iron Fist backwards racial dynamics into the present. Hodalki makes a good point that culture appropriation is usually confined to an institutional perspective approach with rules and guidelines. She calls this a policing approach that requires a colonial perspective and as a result allows a convenient hook for white writers to vent their rage on censorship and ignore racist issues. So now we're going to move on to African culture appropriation. In terms of culture appropriation of Africa, it has always been to highlight a more primitive tribal image, and for African Americans, it tends to draw from slavery, music, clothing style, hair such as afros and cornrows. According to Hodalki, if any dominant group's form of culture production uses the voices or experience of materials or of an oppressed group, it constitutes appropriation. So I'm going to start with Tarzan. Tarzan in the comics is always seen wearing this loin cloth called an exia, X-I-A, it's spelled. He's not African, yet he seems to embody the stereotype of a Western perspective of how they would imagine an African tribesman, only he's more civilized because he's white. Tarzan takes this simple clothing, rarely worn in modern Africa, and turns it into a representation of a romanticized Africa in a way that is racist. I don't have an image, but if you ever see another Tarzan comic, the loincloth he always wears was always leopard print. So Tarzan's appropriate some objects and clothing, but you look at the panel on the right, and Tarzan is interacting with the tribal people, but their words, experience, such as how they should act, stand, and behave, is an example of culture appropriation of experience. Arvid Nelson, who wrote the new version of Tarzan on the right, bases his storyline off of Edgar Rice's Tarzan comic book series on the left. Instead of resisting cultural appropriation, he follows the same similar storyline as Rice's, only with more mature themes. Tarzan is adopted by the Magani people. Um, According to Zunzway, Nelson utilizes elements from the Disney aesthetic interpretation of this people, which is horrible because Disney is notorious for culture appropriation. Nelson borrows culture from the Magani people to develop a collective experience of an ideal tribal people in Africa. And Edgar Rice appropriates a shield and spear in his front cover of a comic book magazine, and which is based on the Zulu tribe in southern Africa, and they bear no relation to the Magani people. Westerners find other cultures interesting and often take the most interesting bits of another culture, story, or artwork that to them stand out for aesthetic purposes. As a result, the comic book as a medium becomes a more insidious aesthetic value. It becomes a commodity that is to be consumed by Westerns and stands in for other cultures and creates excitement to this cultural ambivalence. According to Kuhn, Westerners or Europeans appropriate the experience of other cultures. It is based on a desire to fill a hole that is missing from the dominant culture's imagination. So again, we have two more examples of Tarzan. Both are by Edgar Rice. Again, it seems like he's adopting the spear and shield from the Zulu tribe in the left panel, and I don't think you can quite see the image very well in the right panel, but you'll see a group of tribal people walking, and they're all white. Um, so it's pretty bad. I don't really have words to describe it. Um, he doesn't even include Africans in his comic in the right panel, but he's got a bunch of white people appropriating African style clothing who are supposed to be the African tribal people that Tarzan's interacting with. So he's completely omitted African people out of his comic in this example altogether. So now we're going to move on to Django. So although Django is black, and I believe that the graphic novel is culture appropriation because it serves as uh, part of the historical African slave culture in a way that is more exploitative than accurate. King Foad states that the Django turns a historical tragedy, which still has lingering effects today, into a piece of entertainment for popular consumption, and he finds this disgusting. It's different from the graphic novel Mouse that illustrates the horrors of living through the Holocaust. Mouse teaches about the Holocaust through the eyes of a survivor and a son. It is an account rather than a form of entertainment. With the Django, I wonder if it is right to take a piece of history and turn it into a cartoon with larger than life characters. While some argue that the Django is creative in interpretation, I think that this is an excuse to try to convince readers that this is not a form of cultural appropriation, which I think it is. In considering the dominant culture's argument of freedom of expression and their artistic abilities in comics, the need to express himself at the expense of others is an arrogant way of thinking that gives privileged white writers the authority to determine and validate cultures of minorities. and cultures of non-Western origins, such as East and Southeast Asia and Africa. In terms of comic as artistic medium, uh, Globe and Mail writer Finley writes this problematic quote, "I imagine, therefore I am," which brings up the argument of the non-critical judgment of imagination, which is exactly what Roy Thomas is arguing in regards to Iron Fist and Quentin Tarantino's Django. However, justifying that culture appropriation by freedom of imagination and artistic expression is a racist strategy that, left unchecked, serves to be the ruling ideology in this case for comics. So here's another another example. Day of the Dead. It's a comic called Day of the Dead, and it's basically appropriating the Mexican ceremonial festival Day of the Dead. It's a celebration for dead relatives that occurs at the beginning of the month of November in central and southern Mexico. It's usually feasting, food placed for the dead, face painting that looks like skeletons, and the clothing is very bright, and all of which is to honor dead relatives. But appropriating the iconic skull face painting that is used in the traditional Day of the Dead and put it on a superhero, it devalues the cultural ceremony as a mere costume to be worn for entertainment. So now I'm going to move into First Nations culture appropriation. The freedom of expression is a privilege that is bounded in the lack of the lack of understanding of Western writers, and how silencing one group can enable the other group to articulate the knowledge and culture of a minority group. Non-natives want to consume this culture, Native American culture, in a similar fashion of African and Asian and the Mexican culture. And this desire can take on any form, such as the comics that I've been showing you for the purpose of entertainment. So, Coyote is a Marvel superhero created by Chaz Turog. Um, his background bio is just as absurd as the outfit that he seems to be wearing. So he was orphaned when his parents died in an above ground nuclear test. Um, he is referred to as an American Indian um, who is taken on by a were-coyote, not a werewolf, a were-coyote who fosters him. And then he eventually becomes a were-coyote himself. He slays his adoptive parents, lives alone in the desert. He's able to shift shape, and he has a power by doing a tribal dance. He can move about unseen. So these, like the outfits he's wearing, is an example of cultural appropriation of Native American traditional clothing, but also this tribal dance that he does to turn invisible is also appropriating the ceremonial dances, and similar to like Asian um, culture, it just, from a Western perspective, all clothing and all dances of Native American culture is all the same. And that's the problem with culture appropriation. It tends to do that often, especially in comics. So he kills others who stumble onto his domain, and he's not even though he's considered a superhero, he's not a good character. Um, he tends to be neutral, selfish to his own needs. So according to Root, Native cultures from which aesthetics like clothing and ceremonial forms such as dancing are usually perceived as more interesting, authentic, and exotic by those who do the taking or borrowing. So we have a signature headdress and the leather stripes from traditional Native clothing, but because culture appropriation tends to blend different styles of clothing together, you don't know exactly which indigenous group Turog is appropriating. It's similar to the indigenous dance I just mentioned. Another point I want to make is that Turog uses different pieces of coyote stories that vary between indigenous groups. Coyote is considered a trickster with supernatural powers, and stories range from Pomo and his Coyote stories range from the Pomo group tribe in California to the Great Plains, such as the Winnebago people, Southwest, such as the Apache, and the Great Lake region, such as the Iroquois. These are just a few examples, but Coyote is an important figure in Native American culture. Some stories say that he had a more humanoid appearance, often tricking people for amusement, trying to copy the creator in terms of creation, failing, getting punished, tricking other supernatural beings, and is known to seduce women by turning into the man of their dreams. What Turog does is he takes bits of the stories where a coyote seduces women and can shapeshift from man to coyote and applies this to his character. As a result, we have a character who is not really taken seriously in the Marvel Universe. He seems to be a ladies' man. He's also dangerous, killing people for wandering into his domain. And oral stories of Coyote never depict Coyote as an aggressive being who enjoys killing, although his trickery can at times be mean. The occult appropriation establishes negative stereotypes that indigenous people are wild and barbaric with no sense of civilized reasoning and devalues the significance of oral stories. The panel on the left is from the comic Mortal Kombat again. This character is supposed to be a Native American called Nightwolf. And the most obvious example of culture appropriation is he's wielding a tomahawk and wears a headband with feathers and face paint. He's also known for his martial arts, but we don't know his style, only his kung fu. So again, they're appropriating Native American culture and Asian culture into one character. There's a common recurrence of Western writers, um, such as comic writers, to borrow subject matter to imagine the voice of the other, regardless of historical conditions of oppression and colonization. In this case, the comic on the right panel is supposed to be depicting true events of Pocahontas. Notice her clothing, it's a variation of traditional clothing, but what appears to be more of a Western influence because it looks like a Western dress. So the synopsis of the exciting true adventures of Pocahontas is goes like this. A captured colonial leader condemned to death by Indians is saved by the brave and dramatic act of a lovely Indian princess. Um, the exciting and memorial scene comes alive once more in the engrossing story of Pocahontas, who persuaded her father to spare the life of Captain John Smith. Also, here are many other incidents and episodes in the short but eventful life of Pocahontas and her efforts to help the English. Some historians have suggested that this story of where she tried to save John Smith is untrue. Historical facts explain that she was held captive by the British and held for ransom from which her father couldn't afford it. She was uh, converted to Christianity and took the name Rebecca. Some historical documents said that she was given the options of returning home but refused. She was brought to England and showed to court to demonstrate the civilized savage, and she died at the age of 21 in 1617. So in the exciting true adventures of Pocahontas, while some aspects of historical facts are true, such as her captivity by the British, there is similar to the Django. The comic is used to create a fictional story that appropriates native culture, in this case historical facts, for the form of entertainment. And I mentioned before that appropriating experiences does constitute a form of culture appropriation. This comic is also inaccurate in that it describes or it shows images, comic images of the Powhatans living in teepees, but in reality they lived in thatched roofed houses, similar to longhouses. So again, there's that culture appropriation where all Native Americans live in teepees, but really teepees was uh, the Plains Cree lived in teepees, but the Powhatans were a sedentary group of people who built permanent dwellings. So I mentioned before that Disney is notorious for culture appropriation, and I have an example of them doing that just with First Nations. So here's some examples of appropriating totem poles. Totem poles originate in the Pacific Northwest coast of Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia, and they're usually made from large red cedar. For example, the Haida in British Columbia built totem poles. They are made for different purposes. Some tell stories or clan lineage. Remember how I mentioned that writers and artists who borrow from another culture tend to choose what they perceive as the most interesting aspect or most authentic of the culture. Totem poles, along with headdresses and tomahawks and teepees, are used in artwork and illustrations as they immediately convey Native American and tend to be the most commodified parts of the culture. Um, as Coombs puts it, culture is neatly packaged for the consumer's convenience. Which, in terms of the comics that I have displayed, I have a Batman comic on the right and a Disney comic on the left. The totem poles are displayed in a childish and playful way, but it is this very point that makes illustrating Native culture in such a childish way harmful, because it removes the cultural significance of what totem poles represent. Uh, Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, is another comic. It's a Native American time traveler warrior. The mantle of Turok, which I'm not sure, it's like the necklace looking thing on the right panel. Um, it's on. I don't know if you can see. It's on his chest. It's passed down from generation to the eldest male. Each Turok is charged with protecting the barrier from Earth and the Lost Lands, a primitive world where there is no time. So, according to Matthews, whether it is land or art, money is a reason for culture appropriation. And this explains why comics such as Mortal Kombat, Iron Fist, Django, Turok turn cultures into commodity to be sold as entertainment. According to Pawardi, First Nations in comics are depicted as subhuman to superhero. That line is often blurred. In a very real sense, the superhuman characteristics that are occasionally attributed to First Nations representatives in the 21st century comics are not much different from the subhuman characteristics attributed to the First Nation representatives. Both superhuman and subhuman portrayals serve to isolate First Nations people from a common humanity. The archetype of the warrior represents the strong brave who have ascended to warrior status within tribes. The natural hunter instinct always comes through in the warrior, which results in a stereotype known as the noble savage. The appropriation of First Nations clothing weapons idea of the warrior is used in Torah to establish this concept of noble savage. The Toroks go around the Lost Land killing dinosaurs and aliens, protecting Earth from invasion. It's similar to Asian African culture appropriation comics, where African is always portrayed as more tribal, primitive, African American, slavery, Asian mysticism. The concept of noble savage is based on a Western pop culture perspective that through the comic medium becomes a commodity of entertainment for the Western comic readers. Lacina says, please remember that indigenous people exist, that when you write about indigenous societies, you are writing about us, even in fictional context. and there is a long, dark history of vocabulary you might be inclined to draw upon when writing, mainly tribal, savage, primitive, and brave. And all of these terms, Torok is reinforcing in its appropriating of Native American culture. So now I'm going to end my presentation on talking about culture appropriation and indigenous women. Another problem with culture appropriation is that it makes the female body expendable. And remember, I showed you the model way back in the beginning of the presentation. She had the headdress on, and I showed you that example of the character who was appropriating Asian culture, and she was showing unnecessary cleavage. Western appropriation of First Nations clothing tends to sexualize the female body, um, as in the example, in the other two panels that I talked about. The panel on the right is of Pocahontas. This comic was written in 1970. And although she's covered a little more than the female Turok on the right panel, both are examples of culture appropriation in comics that claim the bodies of indigenous women, turning them into sexual objects. According to Pawardi, images like this remind women and Native Americans that they don't matter and they don't even exist. Culture appropriation marginalizes identities on indigenous women so that their identity is recreated through a Western perspective. Migwin says that when non-natives go down this road, culture appropriation, they help make indigenous bodies into symbols that you can pick up and wear around. So this concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate and respond in the discussion forum. Thank you.